Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. So, at Book Expo America, I'm standing in line in the cafeteria buying some lunch, and it turns out that the woman behind me in line is Carol de Giere, biographer of Jewish superstar composer Stephen Schwartz. You never know where you'll bump into someone worth interviewing. After we ate, I got Carol to tell me about her book, Defying Gravity, The Creative Career of Stephen Schwartz from Godspell to Wicked. After you listen to this interview, be sure to check out Carol's website at defyinggravitythebook.com.
Hi, I'm Carol de Giere, and I wrote the book called Defying Gravity, The Creative Career of Stephen Schwartz from Godspell to Wicked. It's a biography of Stephen Schwartz, but my angle on it was to completely look at his creative process. It's not a full life biography. He grew up in a Jewish home on Long Island, and he was very fortunate that his mother was interested in Broadway and also in folk songs and classical. So he got exposed to a lot of music, and it turned out his next-door neighbor was a Broadway composer. At age 9, he went to that composer's show. It was a show that failed, but it really sparked his interest. And so I was learning about that when I was interviewing him. His first show was Godspell, and then he did Pippin and a number of other musicals. His most famous show now is Wicked. But he also worked in the movie industry, and after doing a couple Disney films, he did the lyrics for Pocahontas and Hunchback of Notre Dame. Then he got a call from Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was working, just started up DreamWorks. So Stephen Schwartz was the first one to get a call to do the songs for their first animated feature, which was going to be The Prince of Egypt. And it was quite fascinating to interview him about that. One of the things he explains about his creative process is that he goes on field trips whenever he can related to the show. He does a lot of research so that his song lyrics and even the tone of the music will be relevant for the particular milieu of the story. So he was working for DreamWorks, and they flew 12 of them over to Egypt. Wow. And they took a boat trip up the Nile and went around. He actually wrote one of the songs there at one of the temples there. So that was pretty cool.
Where did he go to research Wicked?
Oh, that's an interesting question. He actually sat in a library and read all the Frank Baum books, for one thing. Okay. And, of course, he read Gregory Maguire's book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they dwelled in Oz. So that was one of his other processes. Another thing he does is he does a lot of making notes and pre-writing. It's not, I always had this image when I was growing up that composers would sit in a corner by themselves and write songs, and then they'd hand it over to the people doing the show, and that would become a song in a show. It's completely the opposite process. He's involved from the very beginning in shaping the story, especially for Wicked, but actually for any of them. And so it's all a very deeply connected, collaborative effort.
So how did you get into researching this in the first place?
I had finished a writing degree, and I was a freelance writer hired with other freelance writers to write little biographies about musicians. We were all assigned different parts of the alphabet by last name of the composer. And I happened to be assigned a last name that began with S. So I was assigned Stephen Schwartz, among others. And I went out and I found his website. He has a website, stephenschwartz.com. Then I later formed one called musicalschwartz.com. But on his website, I found some information about him and all that he'd done. And his contact information was there. So I contacted him. Could I write a book about you? And he said, no one to date has asked. So I became the first. So readers will find all the behind-the-scenes aspects of the making of Wicked. There's actually 14 chapters on Wicked because I was actually interviewing him at the time they were developing the show.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Wicked is like a Wizard of Oz prequel story. And it has a lot of deep messages, and that really intrigued him. So
cool. That must have been a really exciting thing to be like in the backstage process as that was happening.
It was, and one of the things I did was I flew out to San Francisco. When a show is developed, they have to do a lot of testing of it along the way, so they don't just write it and then put it up on Broadway. It goes through many different readings, and almost always they do an out-of-town tryout. So for Wicked, they went to San Francisco and put on a full production, but it's away from the New York critics, and you get a chance to test it. And so I flew out to San Francisco in summer of 2003 and was able to interview Stephen when they were all kind of tearing their hair about this works and that doesn't work, and it was the first version was like 3 hours and 20 minutes. So they knew they had to cut it way back. And what can you cut? You put everything in there that you think has to be in there.
The book is very dense, so
yeah.
I don't even know how you boil it down to make the musical.
Yeah, that was a major task that they had to work on. So then they had to do a lot of cutting and decision making, but it's so much easier when it's out there in front of an audience. It's a little hard for the actors, though, because the writers would come, well, could you put this change in tonight or soon, And so Adina Menzel was actually telling me that she would write out some of the new lines on Post-it notes and have it in her hand or under her sleeve, that she'd pull out.
So she's got a crib sheet while she's on the stage.
That's it, yeah. Because then the writers can see if it works or not. So they had to be really good sports and very flexible. And then the orchestra, too, was always coping with the flux of the change. And they had all these different notes about the notes.
Right. So that was your first book, right?
It's my first book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you now considering yourself like a biographer of composers? Or
well, I wouldn't mind. I need to find people who are famous enough that there's an audience.
Right.
I'm currently working on a book on Godspell itself. But I'm interested in this whole process of how people create. So I may try to focus on something more general about how a number of composers create their work.
So that's what you want to focus your writing on, is the creative process.
That's it, yeah. And in the book I have about 25 different, they're like sidebars that are called creativity notes, where I asked Stephen and other people I was interviewing to explore different facets of how they were writing. And so I sort of called those out in the book. It's not just about the musical, but it's something that could be applicable to anybody who's collaborating with someone else, or how you work with feedback so that it's useful to you and doesn't overshadow you, and a lot of different subtle points about creating. So
excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
There are so many ways to connect with the Book of Life. Fan us at facebook.com/Book of Life Podcast. Follow us at twitter.com/Book of Life Pod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com, or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. You can also listen to the latest episode by phone at 916-313-3820. And, of course, find links to everything at bookoflifepodcast.com. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida, at cbiboca.org, and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band at freilachmakers.com. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.